Hey there, partner. Tonight we're heading back to the dusty trails and sun-baked towns of the Old West, where a boy named Henry McCarty became a legend known as Billy the Kid. So settle in, maybe pour yourself some coffee or whatever helps you wind down, and let me tell you the true story of one of the most famous outlaws in American history. A story of hardship, survival, and a young man who lived fast and died even faster. Now, before we ride into this tale together, I appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you find yourself enjoying these stories, well, I'd be much obliged if you'd hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Always fascinates me to know who's riding along on these journeys from all corners of the world. Dim them lights if you can. Maybe get yourself comfortable. And let's ease into the story of Billy the Kid together. Picture this. It's November 1859, and somewhere in the Irish slums of New York City, a boy is born into a world that don't much care whether he lives or dies. His name is Henry McCarty, though he won't keep that name long. Most folks won't even remember it. But that boy, barely old enough to walk steady, is already carrying the seeds of a legend that'll outlive empires. His daddy, Patrick McCarty, ain't much more than a ghost in the story. Some say he died when Henry was just a baby. Others reckon he just up and vanished like smoke in the wind, which wasn't uncommon for men in those days when responsibility felt heavier than a blacksmith's anvil. Either way, young Henry never knew what it was like to have a father's steady hand on his shoulder or to hear a man's voice saying "son" with any kind of pride. His mama, Catherine, was left to raise Henry and his younger brother Joe all by herself. Now, Catherine McCarty was tougher than a $2 steak and twice as hard to chew. She had to be. The Five Points district of Manhattan in the 1860s wasn't exactly what you'd call family-friendly. It was a place where children grew up fast or they didn't grow up at all, where the smell of rotting garbage mixed with human desperation created a stench that could knock a buzzard off a gut wagon. Catherine worked whatever job she could find. Seamstress, laundress, anything that'd put food on the table and keep her boys clothed. She had dreams, though. Dreams of somewhere better, somewhere cleaner, somewhere her boys might have a chance to become something more than street rats scrambling for scraps. Young Henry, even as a small child, had a way about him that folks noticed. He was quick with his hands, quick with his feet, and quick with his tongue. He could charm the paint off a barn door when he wanted to, or slip through a crowd like water through your fingers when trouble came knocking. His mama called it clever. The neighbors had less charitable names for it. By the time Henry was 7, Catherine had heard enough stories about the West to make up her mind. Somewhere out there, past the endless prairies and over the mountains, was a place where a woman could start fresh and her boys could breathe clean air. So she gathered up what little they owned, which could fit in 2 carpet bags with room to spare, and they began the long journey west. First stop was Kansas, where Catherine took work as a laundress, and the boys learned what it meant to live in a place where the horizon stretched so far you could almost believe the world was endless. But Kansas wasn't the promised land either. It was just bigger poverty under a bigger sky. Henry was growing up now, maybe 10 or 11, and already showing signs of the man he'd become. He was small for his age, but wiry, with hands that were always moving and eyes that missed nothing. He could read and write better than most grown men, thanks to Catherine's insistence on education. But he was also learning lessons that no schoolmarm would ever teach. He learned how to spot trouble before it spotted him, how to talk his way out of a tight spot, or, if talking failed, how to run fast enough that trouble couldn't catch up. Most importantly, he learned that in this world, you either took care of yourself or nobody would. Catherine remarried in Kansas to a man named William Antrim. Bill wasn't a bad sort, but he wasn't particularly good either. He was the kind of man who had big dreams and small follow-through, always chasing the next opportunity that was going to make them all rich. When he heard about silver strikes down in New Mexico territory, well, that sounded like just the ticket. So off they went again, the newly minted Antrim family, heading south to a territory where the law was more suggestion than requirement, and where a man's past mattered less than how quick he was with a gun. They settled in Silver City, New Mexico, a mining town that had sprung up like a mushroom after rain. It was rough, dusty, and full of men who'd come west to escape something. The law, their families, their failures, or just the memory of who they used to be. Catherine took in boarders to help make ends meet, and for a while things seemed like they might work out. Henry, now about 12 and going by Henry Antrim, was enrolled in school. He was a bright kid, maybe too bright for his own good. He could do sums faster than the teacher, read better than kids twice his age, and had a memory that stored away every slight, every kindness, and every lesson about how the world really worked. But life has a way of kicking you in the teeth just when you think you might be getting somewhere. Catherine started coughing. At first, it was just a little hack, the kind you get when the desert dust settles wrong in your lungs. But it got worse, deeper, wetter. Pretty soon, she was coughing up blood, and everyone in Silver City knew what that meant. Consumption. The slow death that ate you from the inside out. Henry watched his mama waste away day by day, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. He was maybe 13 now, old enough to understand that death was coming, but too young to accept it with anything resembling grace. Catherine McCarty Antrim died on September 16, 1874, and with her went the last anchor Henry had to anything resembling a normal life. Bill Antrim, bless his heart, tried to do right by the boys, but he was already chasing another silver dream in another town, and taking care of two grieving boys wasn't in his wheelhouse. Henry and Joe were more or less on their own now, and Henry, at 13, had to figure out how to survive in a world that had already shown him more cruelty than kindness. Now you might think that losing his mama would have broken young Henry, turned him into just another tragic figure wandering the desert with his heart full of holes. But Henry McCarty wasn't built that way. Instead of breaking, he got harder. Instead of giving up, he got cleverer. And instead of mourning what was lost, he started figuring out what he could take. He took odd jobs around Silver City, cleaning stables, hauling water, running errands for merchants. But honest work was hard work, and it paid about as well as you'd expect in a town where most of the money was buried in the ground or locked up in the bank. Henry had nimble fingers and a quick mind, and it wasn't long before he discovered that other people's belongings had a way of finding their way into his pockets. Nothing too serious at first. An apple here, a few coins there, maybe a pocket watch that some drunk cowboy wouldn't miss till morning. He was good at it too, real good. He had a face that looked innocent as Sunday morning, and a smile that could make you believe he was just a poor orphan boy trying to get by. Which, to be fair, he was. It's just that his definition of getting by was starting to expand beyond what the law might consider reasonable. The first time Henry got arrested, he was about 15. He'd taken some clothes from a Chinese laundry, not because he needed them, mind you, but because Sombrero Jack, a local ne'er-do-well, had dared him to do it. Henry never could back down from a dare, a trait that would follow him to his grave. The sheriff, a man named Harvey Whitehill, was inclined to be lenient. After all, Henry was just a kid, and he wasn't violent or particularly dangerous, just mischievous. So instead of throwing him in with the hardened criminals, Whitehill locked him up in the same room where they kept the coal for the jail stove. Now, Sheriff Whitehill wasn't the brightest candle in the chandelier, bless his heart. He figured a coal room was secure enough to hold one skinny teenager. What he didn't count on was Henry's particular talent for escaping from places that other folks considered escape-proof. Henry studied that coal room like a scholar studies scripture. He noticed that the chimney connected to the coal stove, and if a fellow was small enough and determined enough, well, he might just be able to squeeze up through that chimney and pop out on the roof like a prairie dog, which is exactly what Henry did. One morning, Sheriff Whitehill came to check on his prisoner and found nothing but an empty room and a pile of soot where the boy had been. Henry had vanished into the New Mexico desert like smoke, leaving behind only his childhood and the last pretense that he was just a harmless orphan boy. From that moment on, Henry McCarty was dead. In his place walked a young man who was learning that the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who took what they wanted and those who got it taken from them. He started calling himself Kid Antrim, though folks would soon know him by other names. He drifted from town to town, camp to camp, always moving, always surviving. He learned to play cards, and he learned to cheat at cards. He learned to shoot, and he learned to shoot straight. Most importantly, he learned that in the territory of New Mexico, a man's reputation was worth more than money, and fear was worth more than either. The Kid, and by now everyone was calling him Kid, fell in with a rough crowd in the town of Camp Grant, Arizona. These were hard men who lived by their own rules and settled their disputes with hot lead rather than harsh language. They took a liking to the young man who could outshoot most of them despite being half their age, and who had a laugh that could lighten the mood even when times were darkest. But it was in Camp Grant that Henry learned his most important lesson yet. Sometimes, no matter how clever you are, no matter how fast you can talk or how quick you can run, there comes a moment when you have to decide whether you're going to stand and fight or spend the rest of your life running. That moment came in the form of a man named Frank Windy Cahill, a blacksmith who was built like a bull and had about as much sense. Cahill took pleasure in picking on anyone smaller than himself, which included just about everybody in Camp Grant. He especially enjoyed humiliating the Kid, calling him names, knocking him around, generally treating him like dirt. Now Henry had put up with worse treatment in his short life. He'd been pushed around by bigger, stronger men before. But something about Cahill's particular brand of cruelty rubbed him wrong. Maybe it was because Henry was tired of running. Maybe it was because he'd finally reached the point where a man's pride matters more than a man's safety. Or maybe it was just that Frank Cahill picked the wrong day to push the wrong kid too far. It happened on August 17th, 1877. Henry was playing cards in a saloon when Cahill came in, drunk and looking for trouble. He started in on Henry right away, calling him names that ain't fit to repeat, shoving him around, generally making a spectacle of himself. Henry tried to de-escalate the situation. He really did. He'd learned early that violence was usually the most expensive solution to any problem, but Cahill wasn't interested in peaceful resolution. He wanted blood, and he figured the skinny kid with the fast mouth would be easy prey. He was wrong. The fight started with fists, but it ended with gunpowder. Cahill had Henry down on the ground, choking the life out of him, when Henry managed to get to his gun. Some say it was self-defense, plain and simple. Others claim the kid shot an unarmed man in cold blood. The truth, as usual, was probably somewhere in between. But the result was the same either way. Frank Windy Cahill died with a bullet in his gut, and Henry McCarty became a killer. He was 17 years old. Now, killing a man changes something inside you, whether you want it to or not. It's like crossing a river that ain't got no bridge back. Once you've taken a life, you can't untake it. You can't pretend you're the same person who woke up that morning. Henry knew he couldn't stay in Camp Grant. Hell, he probably couldn't stay in Arizona territory. So he did what he'd been doing his whole life. He ran. But this time, he wasn't just running from poverty or bad luck or cruel stepfathers. He was running from the law, and the law had a longer memory than most. He headed back to New Mexico territory, but he wasn't Henry Antrim anymore. That name was connected to a dead man in Arizona, and dead men had a way of attracting unwanted attention. So he became William Bonney, or sometimes just the Kid. The transformation was complete now. The orphan boy from New York's slums had become a Western gunfighter. The Kid drifted through the territory, working whatever jobs he could find. Cowhand, ranch hand, anything that paid in cash and didn't ask too many questions about a man's past. He was good with horses and better with cattle, and he had a way of making friends wherever he went. You see, Despite everything that had happened to him, despite the hardness that life had ground into him, the kid still had that charm his mama had noticed when he was small. He could make people like him. He was funny, generous with what little he had, and loyal to those who showed him kindness. But he also had a reputation now. Word traveled fast in the territory, and stories had a way of growing in the telling. By the time the tales reached New Mexico, the kid wasn't just a boy who'd killed a man in self-defense. He was a dangerous gunfighter who'd shot down a blacksmith in cold blood. Some of that reputation was earned. Some of it was pure fiction. But all of it was useful. In a land where strength was respected above all else, being feared was almost as good as being loved, and a damned sight more practical. The kid found work on various ranches, and for a while it looked like he might settle down into the life of an ordinary cowboy. He was good at the work. He could ride anything with 4 legs and a heartbeat. He could rope and brand and drive cattle with the best of them. More importantly, he seemed content with the work. But the territory of New Mexico in the 1870s wasn't a place where a man could just mind his own business and expect to be left alone. There were too many competing interests, too much money to be made, and too many men willing to kill for their share of it. The biggest conflict brewing was something folks called the Lincoln County War, though calling it a war was giving it more dignity than it deserved. It was really just a business dispute between 2 groups of men who couldn't agree on who had the right to make money off the hard-working folks of Lincoln County. On one side, you had the Murphy-Dolan faction, led by a man named James Dolan and backed by the territorial government in Santa Fe. They controlled most of the businesses in Lincoln County, the general store, the bank, the government contracts for beef and grain. They'd set up what amounted to a monopoly, and they weren't inclined to share. On the other side was an Englishman named John Tunstall, who'd come to New Mexico with money in his pocket and ideas about free enterprise. Tunstall wanted to set up his own store, his own bank, compete fair and square with the Murphy-Dolan outfit. Now, in a perfect world, this would have been settled in the courts or at the ballot box. But New Mexico territory in 1878 wasn't what you'd call a perfect world. It was a place where judges were bought, sheriffs were crooked, and justice was something you carried in a holster. The kid found himself caught in the middle of this mess, and once again, it wasn't entirely his fault. He'd signed on to work for John Tunstall, partly because the pay was good, and partly because he liked the Englishman's style. Tunstall treated his workers fair, paid them regular, and didn't lord his education and money over them like some men did. More than that, Tunstall seemed to see something in the kid that most people missed. He saw past the reputation and the rough edges to the intelligent, loyal young man underneath. He gave the kid responsibility, treated him with respect, and maybe most importantly, he trusted him. For a boy who'd spent his whole life being pushed around by bigger, stronger, richer men, John Tunstall's friendship was worth more than gold. The kid would have done anything for the Englishman, and as it turned out, he'd get the chance to prove it. The trouble started when Tunstall's business began cutting into the Murphy-Dolan profits. Competition was bad for monopolies, and the Murphy-Dolan faction decided to do something about it. They got a friendly judge to issue some questionable warrants, sent a posse of gunmen disguised as lawmen to arrest Tunstall, and generally made it clear that the Englishman's continued breathing was bad for business. Tunstall, being English and civilized, thought he could resolve the matter through proper legal channels. He figured American justice, however rough around the edges, would eventually protect an honest businessman from a bunch of crooked competitors. He was wrong. On February 18th, 1878, John Tunstall was riding back to his ranch when he was ambushed by a group of men claiming to be acting under legal authority. They shot him down like a dog and left his body in the road as a warning to anyone else who might think about competing with the Murphy-Dolan faction. When word reached the kid, something inside him broke. Not broke like it had when his mama died. That had been grief, natural and clean. This was different. This was rage. cold and sharp as a January wind. The kid had lost his father before he could remember him. He'd lost his mother to consumption. He'd lost his childhood to poverty and his innocence to violence. Now he'd lost the only man who'd ever treated him like he was worth something more than the price on his head. He wasn't going to lose anything else without a fight. Now, when John Tunstall was murdered, the kid could have done what any sensible young man would do. He could have saddled up his horse, ridden out of Lincoln County, and found himself work somewhere else where other men's feuds couldn't reach him. He'd done it before. Hell, running away from trouble was practically his specialty. But the kid wasn't feeling sensible that day. He was feeling like a man who'd had enough of watching decent folks get ground under the boot heels of men who thought money and guns gave them the right to do whatever they pleased. So instead of running, he joined up with a group called the Regulators. Now, the Regulators were supposed to be a legally deputized posse, formed to bring John Tunstall's killers to justice through proper legal channels. On paper, they were the good guys, lawmen seeking justice for a murdered businessman. In reality, they were mostly young men with guns and grudges, led by a man named Dick Brewer, who had his own reasons for hating the Murphy-Dolan faction. The law in Lincoln County was bought and paid for, so the Regulators decided to make their own law, dispensed from the barrel of a gun. The kid fit right in. He was young, he was angry, he could shoot straighter than most men twice his age, and he had a personal reason for wanting to see Tunstall's killers brought to account. Plus, he had that particular combination of loyalty and recklessness that made him willing to follow a fight wherever it led, even if it led straight to hell. The first big confrontation came in the town of Blazers Mills, where the Regulators had tracked down one of Tunstall's suspected killers, a man named Andrew Buckshot Roberts. Now, Roberts was a tough old bird who'd survived more fights than most men had hot dinners, and he wasn't inclined to surrender just because some young guns had come calling. The fight that followed was brutal, even by the standards of the Lincoln County War. Roberts holed up in a building and started shooting, and the Regulators shot back. When the smoke cleared, Roberts was dead, but so was Dick Brewer, the Regulators' leader. The kid had seen men die before, but watching Brewer, a man he respected, a man who'd given him purpose, get his head blown off by a dying man's last shot, well, that was another lesson in how quick and ugly death could be. But the kid didn't have time to mourn. With Brewer dead, someone had to take charge of the Regulators, and the kid found himself stepping into that role. He wasn't the oldest or the most experienced, but he had something the others lacked. He could think on his feet, make quick decisions, and get men to follow him even when common sense suggested they should be running the other direction. The war escalated after Blazers Mills. The Murphy-Dolan faction brought in more guns, including some particularly unsavory characters who were basically hired killers with badges. The Regulators responded by hitting harder and faster, using guerrilla tactics they'd learned fighting Apache and rustlers. The kid was in his element now. He was finally part of something bigger than himself, fighting for a cause he believed in alongside men who depended on him. For a young man who'd spent most of his life alone, the Brotherhood of the Regulators must have felt like family. But the Lincoln County War wasn't just about justice or revenge anymore, if it ever had been. It had become a blood feud, with each side escalating the violence until nobody could remember exactly what they were fighting for. Men were dying on both sides, and the law, what little of it there was, had completely broken down. The climax came during what folks called the 5-day battle in the town of Lincoln itself. The Regulators had taken control of the town, occupying buildings and preparing for a siege. The Murphy-Dolan faction, backed by soldiers from Fort Stanton, surrounded the town and demanded surrender. What followed was 5 days of running gun battles through the streets of Lincoln. Men shot at each other from windows and rooftops, behind adobe walls and water troughs. Citizens huddled in their homes, praying that stray bullets wouldn't find them. The kid was right in the thick of it, organizing defenses, leading raids, generally proving that he'd learned to be a leader as well as a fighter. But leadership in wartime means making impossible decisions, and the kid faced one of those during the battle. The regulators were outnumbered and outgunned, surrounded by enemies and running low on ammunition. They could surrender and probably face a rigged trial and certain execution, or they could try to shoot their way out and probably die in the attempt. The kid chose to fight. On the final day of the battle, as the net was closing around them, the kid led a desperate breakout attempt. In broad daylight, with soldiers and gunmen shooting at them from every direction, the surviving regulators made a run for it. Most of them didn't make it. Men the kid had ridden with, fought alongside, shared beans and coffee with around 100 campfires, were cut down in the streets of Lincoln. The kid watched friends die, and he kept running, because that's what you do when the alternative is jointing them. But he made it out alive, along with a handful of other regulators. They scattered to the four winds, and the Lincoln County War, for all practical purposes, was over. The Murphy-Dolan faction had won, but it was a hollow victory. So many men had died, so much blood had been spilled, that nobody really felt like celebrating. And somewhere out in the desert, a young man who'd started the war as Henry McCarty and fought it as William Bonney was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming Billy the Kid. Now, you might think that after watching most of his friends get gunned down in the streets of Lincoln, Billy might have decided it was time to hang up his guns and try a different line of work. Maybe become a school teacher or a shopkeeper, something peaceful that didn't involve dodging bullets on a regular basis. But Billy the Kid wasn't built for peace. The war had changed him, hardened him, turned him into something that couldn't just settle down and pretend the past hadn't happened. He'd seen too much, lost too much, and killed too much to ever go back to being just another cowhand. More than that, he was wanted now, not just locally, but by the territorial government. The new governor, General Lew Wallace, who would later write the novel Ben-Hur, had issued a general amnesty for participants in the Lincoln County War, but there were exceptions, and Billy the Kid was one of them. So he did what he'd always done when the law came looking. He disappeared into the vast emptiness of New Mexico territory. But this time, he didn't go alone. He'd gathered around him a small gang of men who were in similar circumstances, young, desperate, and skilled with weapons. They called themselves various things, but history remembers them as Billy the Kid's gang. They weren't your typical outlaws, though. They didn't rob banks or hold up trains like the James Gang or other famous criminals of the era. Instead, they rustled cattle, which in New Mexico territory was both easier and more profitable than traditional robbery. See, the thing about cattle rustling is that it's hard to prove and harder to stop. Cattle don't carry serial numbers or ownership papers. If a cow wandered onto your land, who was to say it wasn't yours? And if a few head happened to disappear from someone else's herd during a roundup, well, maybe they just strayed off looking for better grass. Billy and his gang became masters of this particular art form. They'd alter brands, mix stolen cattle in with legitimate herds, and sell them to buyers who didn't ask too many questions about provenance. It was steady work, and it paid better than Cowboy ever had. But rustling wasn't just about the money for Billy. It was also about revenge. Many of the ranchers they stole from had supported the Murphy-Dolan faction during the war. Taking their cattle was Billy's way of continuing the fight by other means. The law, such as it was, couldn't seem to catch up with Billy and his boys. They knew every canyon, every water hole, every hiding place in southeastern New Mexico. They could disappear into the desert like smoke and reappear 100 miles away before the local sheriff even knew they'd been there. Billy had become a master of what folks today might call guerrilla warfare. He traveled light, moved fast, and never stayed in one place long enough for his enemies to find him. He had informants in every town, friends on every ranch, and enough natural charisma to make people want to help him, even when common sense suggested they should turn him in for the reward money. And there was reward money. Quite a bit of it, actually. The territorial government, pushed by angry ranchers and embarrassed lawmen, had put a substantial bounty on Billy's head. Dead or alive, as the saying went, though most folks figured dead was more likely than alive. But Billy seemed to lead a charmed life. He'd been in more gunfights than most men had arguments, and he always walked away. Sometimes he was wounded. He carried scars from several encounters, but he was never hurt bad enough to slow him down for long. Part of it was skill. Billy was genuinely fast with a gun, maybe not the fastest who ever lived like some of the dime novels claimed, but fast enough that most men didn't want to test him. More than that, he was smart about when and where to fight. He didn't pick fair fights because fair fights were for fools and dead men. But part of it was also luck. And Billy was smart enough to know that luck doesn't last forever. He started making plans for getting out of the outlaw business. Maybe heading to Mexico or South America, where the American law couldn't reach him. Those plans would have been wise if he'd stuck to them. But Billy had one weakness that would eventually prove fatal. He couldn't resist coming back to places where he'd been happy. And despite everything that had happened, despite all the violence and death and betrayal, New Mexico territory was still home to him. He had friends there, and more than friends. There were young women in various towns who looked forward to his visits, who enjoyed his stories and his laughter, and didn't seem to mind that he was probably the most wanted man in the territory. Billy was still young, barely past 20, and he had all the normal desires of a young man, including the desire for companionship and affection. So instead of lighting out for Mexico like a sensible outlaw would do, Billy kept coming back to New Mexico, kept riding the same trails and visiting the same towns. He was getting careless, or maybe just tired of running. Either way, his luck was about to change. Now, while Billy the Kid was out there rustling cattle and dodging the law, the good citizens of New Mexico territory were getting mighty tired of having their livestock stolen and their peace disturbed. The territorial government was under pressure to do something about the outlaw problem, and they decided what they needed was a sheriff who wasn't afraid to go after the most dangerous men in the territory. Enter Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett, though most folks just called him Pat. Now, Pat Garrett was an interesting choice for sheriff, considering he'd once been friendly with Billy the Kid. They'd known each other in the days before Billy became an outlaw, had probably shared drinks and stories in various saloons around New Mexico. But Garrett had chosen a different path. Instead of living outside the law, he'd decided to represent it. He was a big man, well over 6 feet tall, with the kind of presence that made people pay attention when he walked into a room. He was also smart, patient, and absolutely determined to bring law and order to Lincoln County. When the voters elected Garrett sheriff in November 1880, Billy probably figured it was just another corrupt lawman who could be bought off or avoided. After all, he'd been dodging sheriffs for years, and most of them were either cowards or crooks or both. But Pat Garrett was different. He understood Billy in a way that other lawmen didn't, because he'd known him before he became a legend. He knew Billy's habits, his friends, his favorite hiding places. More importantly, he understood that Billy's greatest strength, his ability to charm people and win their loyalty, could also be turned into a weakness. Garrett started building a network of informants, people who would report Billy's movements in exchange for money or favors, or just the promise of protection from retaliation. It was slow work, but Garrett was a patient man, and he knew that eventually someone would give him the information he needed. That someone turned out to be a man named Jose Valdez, who'd been riding with Billy's gang but had grown tired of the outlaw life. In December 1880, Valdez sent word to Garrett that Billy and his remaining men were holed up in an abandoned building at a place called Stinking Springs, about 20 miles northeast of Fort Sumner. Garrett gathered a posse of deputy sheriffs and set out immediately. He knew that if Billy got word they were coming, he'd disappear again, and it might be months or even years before they got another chance like this. The posse surrounded the building at Stinking Springs before dawn on December 23rd, 1880. It was cold, bitter cold, the kind of cold that makes your breath smoke and your fingers stiff around a trigger. Garrett positioned his men carefully, making sure every possible exit was covered. When the sun came up, Billy and his gang found themselves trapped. There was nowhere to run, no back door to slip through, no friendly darkness to cover their escape. For the first time in his career as an outlaw, Billy the Kid was well and truly caught. But Billy wasn't one to give up without a fight. When Garrett called for surrender, Billy's answer came in the form of gunshots. What followed was a day-long siege, with bullets flying back and forth while both sides tried to figure out their next move. The turning point came when one of Billy's men, Charlie Boder, tried to make a run for it. He was shot down before he made it 10 yards from the building. Seeing his friend die seemed to take the fight out of Billy, or maybe he just realized that this time there wasn't going to be a miraculous escape. Late that afternoon, with their ammunition running low and their situation hopeless, Billy and the surviving members of his gang surrendered to Pat Garrett. It was the end of Billy the Kid's career as an outlaw, though not quite the end of his story. When Billy the Kid surrendered to Pat Garrett at Stinking Springs, he probably figured his story was over. After all, he was wanted for multiple murders, and the territory of New Mexico wasn't known for its lenient treatment of killers. Most men in his position would have been looking at a short trial and a long rope, but Billy had one thing going for him that most outlaws didn't. He was famous. The newspapers had been writing about his exploits for years, and dime novelists had turned him into a folk hero. Half the country thought he was a cold-blooded killer, but the other half saw him as a romantic figure, a young man driven to outlawry by circumstances beyond his control. Governor Lew Wallace, the same man who'd refused to include Billy in the general amnesty after the Lincoln County War, now found himself in an awkward position. Public opinion was divided, and there were questions about whether Billy could get a fair trial. Some folks were even suggesting that maybe the kid deserved a chance to tell his side of the story. So Wallace made Billy an offer that probably surprised everyone, including Billy himself. If the kid would testify against some of the other participants in the Lincoln County War, men who were arguably more guilty than Billy but had escaped justice because they had better connections, Wallace would consider granting him a pardon. It was a devil's bargain, and Billy knew it. Testifying against former enemies would make him a target for revenge, assuming he lived long enough to collect on Wallace's promise. And promises from politicians, as Billy had learned, weren't worth the paper they were written on. But what choice did he have? The alternative was almost certain conviction and execution. So Billy agreed to cooperate, and for a few months in early 1881, he was held in relative comfort in Santa Fe while lawyers and politicians tried to work out the details of his testimony. Billy played his part, giving depositions and preparing to testify in various trials. But as the weeks dragged on, it became clear that Wallace was having second thoughts about the pardon. The political winds had shifted, and keeping Billy alive was starting to look like more trouble than it was worth. In March 1881, Wallace made his real intentions clear. Instead of honoring his promise of a pardon, he had Billy transferred to Lincoln County to stand trial for the murder of Sheriff William Brady, who'd been killed during the Lincoln County War. Billy realized he'd been played. The governor had used him to gather information and testimony, and now he was going to let him hang anyway. It was a betrayal that cut deep, partly because Billy had actually started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he might have a chance at a legitimate life. The trial was held in Mesilla, and it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. The judge was hostile, the prosecutor was ambitious, and the jury was made up of men who'd already decided Billy was guilty before they heard a word of evidence. On April 13th, 1881, Billy the Kid was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The judge, in words that have echoed through history, told Billy that he would be hanged until you are dead, dead, dead. Billy's response was typical of his dark humor. And you can go to hell, hell, hell. They transferred him back to Lincoln County to await execution, which was scheduled for May 13th, 1881, Friday the 13th, which somebody probably thought was real clever. He was held in the Lincoln County Courthouse, which had been converted into a makeshift jail under the guard of two deputies, James Bell and Robert Ollinger. Now, Bob Ollinger was not a nice man. He'd fought on the Murphy-Dolan side during the war, and he took personal pleasure in tormenting Billy. He would sit outside the kid's cell, cleaning his shotgun and talking about how he was looking forward to watching Billy dance at the end of a rope. James Bell, on the other hand, was a decent sort who treated Billy with professional courtesy but no particular cruelty. It was that difference in character that would prove crucial in what happened next. Billy had been planning his escape from the moment they locked him up. He studied the guards' routines, noted the courthouse's layout, and waited for the right opportunity. That opportunity came on April 28, 1881, when Ollinger went across the street for dinner, leaving Bell alone to watch the prisoner. What exactly happened next has been debated by historians for more than a century. Some say Billy managed to slip his small hands out of his shackles. Others claim he had help from friends on the outside. But however he did it, Billy got hold of a gun and found himself facing James Bell. Bell, to his credit, didn't try to be a hero. When Billy ordered him to put his hands up, he complied. But as Billy was trying to figure out his next move, Bell made a run for it. Billy, probably acting more on instinct than calculation, shot him. Bell staggered out of the courthouse and died on the front steps, probably wondering how a routine guard duty had turned into his last day on Earth. Ollinger heard the gunshot and came running, which was exactly what Billy was hoping for. As the deputy came through the courthouse door, Billy stepped to the second-floor window with Ollinger's own shotgun and called his name. When Ollinger looked up, Billy said something that various witnesses remembered differently, but the gist was, "Hello, Bob." Then he pulled both triggers. Robert Ollinger died instantly, blown apart by his own weapon. It was poetic justice of a sort, though Bell's death was probably unnecessary and certainly haunted Billy in whatever time he had left to think about such things. Billy then took his time gathering weapons and ammunition from the courthouse armory, cut his leg shackles with an axe, and calmly walked out of Lincoln. The whole town had heard the shooting, but nobody was inclined to interfere with an armed and desperate man who'd just proven he was willing to kill to stay free. He stole a horse and rode out of Lincoln for the last time, disappearing into the desert that had sheltered him so many times before. For a brief moment, it must have seemed like old times. Billy the Kid was free again, back in his element, master of the vast spaces of New Mexico territory. But this time was different. This time, Pat Garrett took the escape personally. Pat Garrett was not a man who liked being made to look foolish, and Billy's spectacular escape from the Lincoln County Courthouse had done exactly that. Here was Garrett, the sheriff who'd supposedly tamed the most dangerous outlaw in New Mexico territory, and his prisoner had waltzed out of jail after killing 2 guards. The newspapers were having a field day with the story. Some painted Billy as a romantic hero who'd outwitted his captors through cleverness and daring. Others portrayed him as a cold-blooded killer who'd murder anyone who stood between him and freedom. Either way, Garrett looked like a fool, and that wasn't something he was prepared to tolerate. More than that, Garrett knew that if he didn't recapture Billy quickly, every two-bit outlaw in the territory would figure that the sheriff could be beaten. His authority, maybe his very life, depended on proving that nobody, not even Billy the Kid, could make a fool out of Pat Garrett and live to brag about it. So Garrett set out after Billy with the grim determination of a man whose reputation was on the line. He knew the Kid better than any lawman alive. He understood Billy's habits, his favorite hiding places, his network of friends and lovers scattered across southeastern New Mexico. Billy, meanwhile, was learning what it meant to be truly alone for the first time in his outlaw career. His gang was scattered or dead. His political allies had abandoned him, and the reward on his head was now substantial enough that even his friends might be tempted to betray him. He spent his days moving constantly, never staying in one place more than a night or two. He'd lost weight, grown jumpy, started seeing potential enemies in every shadow. The carefree young outlaw was becoming a haunted fugitive, aged beyond his 21 years by the constant stress of being hunted. But Billy was still Billy, and despite everything, he couldn't resist the temptation to visit the places and people that had made him happy. He'd sneak into Fort Sumner at night to see friends, or ride to some isolated ranch where he knew he'd find a warm meal and friendly conversation. It was that weakness, that very human need for companionship and comfort, that would eventually doom him. Fort Sumner was Billy's favorite refuge during those final weeks. It was a small town built around an old military post, populated mostly by Hispanic families who'd known Billy for years. They liked him, despite his reputation, because he spoke Spanish, treated them with respect, and never caused trouble when he visited. More importantly, Fort Sumner was home to a young woman named Paulita Maxwell, who had captured Billy's heart in a way that no other woman ever had. She was pretty, intelligent, and kind, and she seemed to genuinely care for the young outlaw despite knowing full well what he was. Billy couldn't stay away from Fort Sumner, and Paulita Maxwell was the reason why. Love, or something close to it, had made him reckless in a way that all of Garrett's manhunting skills never could. Garrett knew about Billy's weakness for Fort Sumner, and he'd been watching the town for weeks, waiting for the kid to make an appearance. He had informants there, people who would send word when Billy was spotted. It was just a matter of patience, and Garrett was a patient man. The end came on July 14th, 1881, a hot summer night when the desert air was still and heavy with the promise of rain that wouldn't come for weeks. Billy had ridden into Fort Sumner to see Paulita, and he was staying at the home of Pete Maxwell, Paulita's brother. Garrett got word that Billy was in town, and he moved immediately. Along with two deputies, John Poe and Tip McKinney, he surrounded the Maxwell house just after midnight. The plan was simple. Wait for Billy to come out, then call for his surrender. If he refused, well, they'd do what they had to do. But Billy didn't come out. Instead, he stayed inside, probably talking with Paulita, enjoying what would turn out to be the last peaceful moments of his short life. As the hours passed, Garrett grew impatient. He decided to take a more direct approach. Leaving his deputies outside to cover the exits, Garrett entered the Maxwell house through the front door. He made his way to Pete Maxwell's bedroom, intending to question him about Billy's whereabouts. What happened next has been debated and analyzed for more than a century, but the basic facts are clear enough. Billy, probably alerted by some sound or instinct, came into Maxwell's bedroom just as Garrett was questioning Pete. The room was dark, pitch black, really, and neither man could see the other clearly. Billy sensed a stranger's presence and asked, in Spanish, "Who is it? ¿Quién es? Who is it? Who is it?" Garrett recognized the voice immediately, without hesitation, without calling for surrender, without giving Billy any chance to explain himself. Pat Garrett drew his gun and fired twice. The first bullet caught Billy in the heart, killing him instantly. The second went wide, burying itself in the wall. Billy the Kid collapsed to the floor of Pete Maxwell's bedroom, dead at 21 years old, 3 months, and a handful of days. Pat Garrett had finally gotten his man. When word spread that Billy the Kid was dead, the reaction was mixed, which pretty much summed up how folks had felt about him while he was alive. Some people celebrated, figuring that justice had finally been served and that the territory would be a safer place without him. Others mourned, seeing in his death the end of a romantic era when a man could live free, answerable to nobody but himself. The newspapers naturally had a field day. Some praised Garrett as a hero who'd rid New Mexico of its most dangerous criminal. Others questioned whether shooting an unarmed man in the dark really qualified as heroic law enforcement. The debate raged for weeks, and in some ways, it's still going on today. Billy was buried the next day in the Fort Sumner Cemetery, in an unmarked grave alongside two of his gang members who'd been killed earlier. The funeral was simple, attended mostly by the Hispanic families who'd known and liked him. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, just a young man being laid to rest under the wide New Mexico sky he'd loved so much. Pat Garrett went on to have a distinguished career in law enforcement, at least for a while. He wrote a book about his pursuit of Billy the Kid, helped cement his own reputation as the man who tamed the frontier. But he never quite escaped the shadow of that night in Pete Maxwell's bedroom. Some folks always wondered if he could have taken Billy alive, if maybe the kid deserved a chance to surrender before being gunned down in the dark. The truth is, we'll never know what might have happened if Garrett had called for surrender first. Maybe Billy would have given up peacefully. Maybe he would have gone for his gun and died fighting. Maybe he would have tried to escape and been shot while running. All we know for sure is that Pat Garrett made a split-second decision in a dark room, and Billy the Kid died because of it. But death, as Billy himself might have observed, was just the beginning of his real fame. Within weeks of his killing, the dime novelists were turning out stories about his exploits, each one more outrageous than the last. According to these tales, Billy had killed 21 men, one for each year of his life, though historians today figure the real number was 21, probably closer to 4 or 5. The stories grew in the telling, as stories always do. Billy became faster, deadlier, more charming, more tragic with each retelling. He was transformed from a small-time cattle rustler and gunfighter into a legendary figure of the American West, a symbol of freedom and rebellion against authority. Movies would be made about him, books would be written, songs would be sung. Tourists would come to New Mexico to see where he'd lived and died. His grave would become a pilgrimage site for folks fascinated by outlaw legends. Even today, more than a century after his death, Billy the Kid remains one of the most recognizable figures of the Old West. But strip away all the mythology, all the romantic nonsense about noble outlaws and heroic lawmen, and what you're left with is a simpler, sadder story. You're left with a boy named Henry McCarty who never had much of a chance from the day he was born. A boy who lost his father before he could know him, his mother while he was still young, and his innocence when he killed his first man at 17. You're left with a young man who spent his short life looking for something, family, belonging, purpose, love, in all the wrong places, who found friendship and loyalty among other outcasts and misfits, who fought for causes he believed in, who tried to live by his own code of honor in a world that didn't much value honor. You're left with a human being who made mistakes, some of them terrible ones, but who never lost his capacity for charm, humor, and genuine affection for the people who treated him well, who could be generous with what little he had, loyal to his friends, and kind to those who showed him kindness. Most of all, you're left with a reminder that behind every legend is a real person, with real hopes and fears and dreams and regrets. Billy the Kid wasn't a superhero or a monster. He was just a young man trying to survive in a hard world who lived fast and died young and left behind a story that folks are still telling more than a century later. Now, as our tale draws to a close and the desert wind starts to whisper through the sagebrush, it's worth remembering that the story of Billy the Kid is really the story of America itself in those wild, uncertain years after the Civil War. It's a story about what happens when law and order break down, when honest folks are left to fend for themselves, and when young men with too much pride and too little guidance try to make their own way in an unforgiving world. Billy lived during a time when the frontier was closing, when the old ways of settling disputes with guns and violence were giving way to courts and lawyers and territorial governments. He was caught between two worlds, the wild, free West of his youth and the civilized, regulated America that was coming whether he liked it or not. In many ways, he was a relic before his time, a throwback to an earlier era when a man's word was his bond and his gun was his law. The world was changing around him, and he never quite figured out how to change with it. Maybe he never wanted to. There's a tragedy in that, but there's also a kind of nobility. Billy the Kid never surrendered his essential self, never allowed the world to break him completely, even when it took away everything he cared about. He remained true to his own code, flawed as it was, right up to the moment Pat Garrett's bullet found his heart. And maybe that's why his story endures, why we're still talking about a small-time outlaw who died at 21 in a dark room in Fort Sumner. Maybe it's because, in our own complicated, regulated, often frustrating world, we still admire folks who refuse to be broken, who choose to live on their own terms, even when the cost is everything they hold dear. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe we just like stories about young people who dare greatly, who choose adventure over safety, who burn bright and fast like shooting stars across the desert sky. Billy the Kid was many things: outlaw, killer, friend, enemy, legend. But most of all, he was young. And there's something about youth, with all its passion and recklessness and impossible dreams, that speaks to something deep inside all of us, no matter how old we get or how settled we become. So here's to Henry McCarty, who became William Bonney, who became Billy the Kid. Here's to a boy who never had much of a chance, but who made the most of what he had. Here's to a young man who lived more in 21 years than most folks manage in twice that time. And here's to all the young dreamers and rebels and misfits who come after him, who look at the world as it is and decide they'd rather take their chances with the world as it might be. The West was wild once, and men like Billy the Kid helped make it that way. Now it's tame and civilized and probably better for it. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right across the New Mexico desert, you can almost hear the echo of hoofbeats and gunfire, the ghost of laughter around a campfire, the memory of a time when anything seemed possible, and a young man with quick hands and a quicker smile could ride free under the endless sky. That's the real legacy of Billy the Kid, not the violence or the killing or the breaking of laws, but the reminder that once upon a time, in a place not so different from where you might be sitting right now, there lived people who chose freedom over safety, adventure over comfort, and legend over a long, quiet life. They paid a price for those choices, most of them. But they lived, truly lived, in a way that most of us never will. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and your thoughts turn to roads not taken and dreams deferred, that's worth remembering. Sweet dreams, partner. May your rest be peaceful and your morning full of possibilities. The wind dies down, the campfire burns low, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote calls to the moon. Another tale from the Old West comes to an end, but the memory lingers on, like the smell of sage and the sound of spurs on hard-packed dirt. Until next time, this is Late Cowboy Tales, reminding you that every legend was once just a person with a story worth telling. Sleep well, and remember, in dreams, we're all free to ride the open range.